The cabin was alive with the ordinary sounds of boarding: overhead bins slamming shut, flight attendants directing traffic, children fidgeting in their seats. In the middle of all that movement, one woman settled quietly into her assigned first-class seat. Her presence didn't need to be loud to command attention. It was in the way she moved, steady, composed, every gesture reflecting someone who'd worked too hard and come too far to second-guess her place in the world. The aisle parted briefly as a man stepped forward. Older, broad-shouldered, the kind of figure used to being obeyed. His tailored jacket brushed against the armrests as he strode down the row, stopping right at her seat. For a moment, the air seemed to pause between them. He looked down, not with curiosity, but with the entitlement of someone convinced he could never be challenged. "That's my seat," he declared, his tone dismissive, as if the matter required no discussion. She glanced at her boarding pass, calm and unbothered. "This is 2A," she replied softly, already holding the proof in her hand. The man's eyes narrowed, his lips curved in the faintest smirk, the kind that said he had never been told no by anyone who looked like her. He didn't ask the flight crew to double-check. He didn't pull out his own ticket. He simply dropped his carry-on at his feet and stared as though her presence itself was an offense. Nearby passengers leaned in, trying not to stare yet unable to look away. Whispers rippled through the row behind them. Some watched with discomfort, others with thinly veiled amusement, all sensing that this wasn't just a mix-up. This was something else. The attendant closest to them shifted uneasily, torn between the written assignment on the woman's ticket and the cold certainty in the man's voice. "Sir, ma'am, please. Let's not hold up boarding." Her silence was steady, her expression unshaken. She had weathered worse storms than a seat dispute. But the injustice was plain, and every second it stretched, the humiliation deepened. The man reached for the armrest, sliding into the space as though her claim didn't exist. A few gasps broke out. Someone muttered, "This isn't right." Still, no one intervened. The cabin was an audience, every set of eyes locked on the quiet collision of power and prejudice. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You don't belong here. Move." It was cruel in its simplicity. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. A verdict, delivered with the kind of confidence money and privilege had shielded for decades. Her hand tightened around her boarding pass. She didn't shout, she didn't rise. Her stillness cut deeper than anger ever could. Passengers waited, unsure if she would give in, unsure if anyone would force the issue. The flight attendant's hesitation said enough. Status and wealth weighed more than fairness. The billionaire shifted fully into the seat now, brushing her presence aside as if she were invisible. A murmur swept across the row, a tension that burned hotter than any argument. Phones tilted upward, cameras ready, because everyone sensed this was no longer a simple dispute over a number on a ticket. Her eyes lowered briefly, not in defeat, but in decision. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and pressed it to her ear. The billionaire leaned back, smug and certain he had won. He couldn't have been more wrong, because what she did next silenced the cabin, and within days, ended his empire. Quick note before we continue. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, and in the comments, let us know the country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these voices travel. Her name carried weight in every boardroom she entered. Sonia Wallace. To some, she was the quiet storm that had reshaped the way global companies looked at leadership. To others, she was proof that brilliance, discipline, and resolve could outlast every wall placed in her path. Sonia had grown up far from private jets and marble lobbies. Her childhood was marked by long bus rides to underfunded schools, by the quiet resilience of a mother who worked double shifts to keep the lights on, and by a community that told her, time and again, that she would have to be twice as good just to be considered half as worthy. She didn't resent it, she absorbed it. She turned every slight into fuel, every doubt into evidence that she would not be dismissed. By 35, she had already built a reputation as a visionary strategist. By 40, she was CEO of a multinational firm, with partnerships stretching across 3 continents. The media often described her as unshakable, but what they didn't see were the late nights, the isolation, the weight of carrying not just her own ambitions, but the unspoken responsibility of representing those who rarely got a seat at the table. This flight was supposed to be routine. A short journey before stepping into one of the most significant negotiations of her career. She was traveling to finalize a $4.8 billion partnership that would open access to African markets. a deal that would redefine an airline's global presence and at the same time create unprecedented opportunities for underserved regions. She had reviewed the terms countless times, numbers, clauses, contingencies, all memorized. But more than the financial stakes, Sonia knew this agreement represented something deeper: recognition. For years, corporations had extracted profit without acknowledging the brilliance and innovation that came from Africa. This deal would change that, and she had positioned herself at the center of it. Sonia's demeanor on the plane reflected her life's philosophy. She wasn't one to flaunt her status. She didn't dress to intimidate, though the tailored elegance of her charcoal blazer and pearl earrings spoke of someone who knew her worth. She carried herself with a calm authority that drew respect without demanding it. Even now, as the man loomed over her seat, dismissing her presence as though she were invisible, she remained composed. Because Sonia Wallace had long ago learned the truth. Power isn't always in the volume of your voice, but in the steadiness of your resolve. Her colleagues often said she had a talent for silence. In negotiations, she could listen so intently that those across the table folded under their own words. On stage, her pauses carried more gravity than applause. On this plane, her silence was not weakness, it was warning. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, moments away from confirming an agreement that would elevate the very airline she was flying, yet inside its cabin, she was treated as though her presence was a mistake. The billionaire who had shoved himself into her seat didn't know her face, didn't know her influence, didn't even consider that the woman he was attempting to erase might hold the pen that could sign away his fortune. Sonia exhaled slowly, her boarding pass still in her hand. She didn't need to shout for the truth to be visible. Every passenger nearby could see the row number printed in bold. Every whisper confirmed it. She was exactly where she belonged. And yet, the humiliation lingered. Not because she questioned her right, but because it reminded her of the same stories she'd lived through all her life. A society eager to take her brilliance in boardrooms, in spreadsheets and billion-dollar ideas, but unwilling to grant her basic dignity in public spaces. The seat was hers. The deal was hers. The moment, however, had been stolen. But Sonia Wallace was not a woman who allowed theft to stand unanswered. The last few passengers were making their way down the narrow aisle, tugging at bags that refused to fit in overhead bins. Sonia had already tucked her carry-on neatly above her row and lowered herself into 2A, the leather cool against her arm. For her, flying had become second nature. The announcements, the fastening of seatbelts, even the slight bump of turbulence were all part of the rhythm of a life lived constantly in motion. Yet there was something about this flight that felt different. She could sense eyes on her, a quick glance here, a longer stare there, as though her very presence in first class had disturbed an invisible order. She ignored it. She had ignored it 1,000 times before. Attention always came with assumptions, and assumptions rarely leaned in her favor. The cabin quieted for just a moment as a man stepped into the aisle. His arrival carried the weight of expectation. He wasn't simply boarding. He was entering a space he believed belonged to him. Richard Halden, billionaire investor, media darling, a man whose name had appeared on more front pages than most politicians. He was older now, silver hair, heavy-set shoulders, but his eyes still carried the sharp glint of entitlement. He moved with the impatience of someone who had never been told to wait. The line behind him faltered as he stopped at row 2. He stared down, his brow furrowing at the sight of Sonia seated where he expected to be. The murmur of passengers behind him hushed into silence. "That's my seat," he said flatly, dropping his bag at his feet. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It carried the weight of someone who assumed his word alone settled every matter. Sonia glanced up, unfazed, and lifted her boarding pass from the armrest. "This is 2A, she replied, holding the slip just long enough for him to see the bold print. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was factual. Richard didn't look at the ticket. He didn't acknowledge it at all. Instead, he tilted his head as if she had interrupted his schedule, as though she was an obstacle to be removed. "I always sit here," he muttered with a smirk that said more than his words. The flight attendant nearest to them shifted nervously. She was young, cheeks flushed with the strain of trying to keep passengers moving. "Sir, we can double-check your boarding pass," she offered gently, but her eyes flicked toward Sonia in a way that suggested she'd already made a choice. Richard shook his head. "No need. That's my seat." A woman across the aisle whispered, "But she's already there." Another passenger behind them pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly toward the confrontation. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened, uncomfortable, but charged with curiosity. People knew they were watching something bigger than a seating mix-up. Sonia remained still, her posture straight. She didn't argue. She didn't move. Years of experience had taught her that moments like these weren't about logic. They were about power. And right now, the imbalance was glaring. The attendant leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Ma'am, perhaps if you don't mind, we can move you to another available seat, just to keep things calm." The suggestion landed like a blade. It wasn't an offer. It was a dismissal. The seat Sonia had paid for, the space she rightfully occupied, was being treated as optional simply because someone louder and wealthier had demanded it. Her lips parted, but she didn't raise her voice. "I mind," she answered. The firmness in her tone cut through the tension. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Richard scoffed audibly, lowering himself into the space beside her, elbow grazing hers as though he had already claimed victory. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough for those in the row behind to hear. The whispers grew louder now, passengers glancing at one another with discomfort. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others said nothing, their silence an uneasy shield. The crew exchanged uncertain looks, caught between the printed boarding pass and the billionaire's reputation. The humiliation was subtle, but it was piercing. Sonia felt the heat of every stare on her skin, the weight of every assumption hovering over her. To them, she was not the CEO on her way to secure a deal that could alter the industry. She was simply a black woman being told to move. She adjusted her blazer, not in surrender, but in defiance. The moment demanded composure, not collapse. She would not give them the satisfaction of shrinking. The flight attendant excused herself hurriedly, whispering something to the captain as she walked briskly toward the front of the cabin. The man in 2B leaned back with a smug expression, drumming his fingers on the armrest, as if the matter had been settled. But it hadn't. Because Sonia Wallace had no intention of leaving that seat, and the decision she was about to make would turn this cabin into the stage of a reckoning that no one on board would forget. The pause stretched too long. Every second of silence in that cabin became a verdict. The passengers weren't simply waiting for the flight to take off. They were watching a contest of belonging, of power, of dignity. Richard Halden leaned further into the space between them. His elbow pressed deliberately against Sonia's arm, his body angled to claim authority over a seat that wasn't his. He didn't ask the attendant for clarity. He didn't produce his own ticket. He simply occupied. The flight attendant returned, her face tight with the unease of someone forced to balance rules against reputation. She bent slightly toward Sonia, lowering her voice as if attempting to hide the bias from those seated around them. "Ma'am, please. It will make things easier if you just allow him to sit here. We can relocate you." Relocate. The word stung. She wasn't a misplaced item to be shuffled around for convenience. She had checked in, passed security, followed every process. Still, her presence in that seat was being treated as provisional, subject to erasure the moment someone more powerful wanted it. Sonia lifted the boarding pass again, holding it steady so the attendant could not claim confusion. "This is 2A. My name is on this ticket." The attendant's eyes darted nervously toward Richard. He smirked, leaning back as though victory had already been handed to him. "She's making a scene," he murmured, his words meant for nearby passengers but loud enough to humiliate. A woman in row 3 frowned, shaking her head. "She's not making a scene, she's sitting in her seat." The remark earned a few nods, but no one spoke louder. The majority stayed quiet, their discomfort heavy but their intervention absent. The silence of the many gave cover to the arrogance of the one. Richard shifted, lifting his carry-on onto his lap and settling fully into the seat, half of his frame already spilling into Sonia's space. "If you won't move, I will make do," he said coldly, claiming both armrests with the entitled ease of someone who had never been denied comfort. Gasps broke out. A man across the aisle muttered, "This is ridiculous," pulling his phone higher to capture the scene. The quiet whir of cameras clicking open punctuated the growing tension. Passengers understood they were witnessing something historic in its pettiness and brutal in its clarity. Sonia didn't flinch. She adjusted her posture, narrowing her space but refusing to give an inch beyond what had already been taken. Every instinct in her body screamed against the humiliation, but her expression remained unbroken. The control she held was not for his benefit, it was for herself. The attendant sighed heavily, clearly flustered. "Sir, ma'am, please, we need to depart on time." She turned toward Sonia again, her voice carrying a sharp edge now. "If you cooperate, we can settle this quickly." cooperate, as though she were the one causing the disruption, as though existing in the seat she had paid for and been assigned was an act of rebellion. The distortion of fairness was stark, and every passenger could see it. Richard leaned closer, his breath hot with disdain. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his tone dripping with the certainty of someone accustomed to doors opening at the mention of his name. Sonia's eyes flicked toward him for the first time since he had arrived. The calmness there wasn't deference, it was quiet fire. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The refusal to acknowledge his demand for recognition was, in itself, the sharpest rejection. Behind them, the murmurs grew louder. "She has the ticket. Why are they letting him get away with this? It's plain racism." The words weren't shouted, but they carried across the row, undeniable in their truth. Yet still, the crew hesitated. The structure of authority leaned toward the billionaire, his reputation outweighing justice. Sonia understood the message clearly. Her rights were negotiable. His comfort was not. The humiliation deepened when Richard reclined, stretching casually as though the confrontation were already settled. He placed his bag beneath the seat with exaggerated confidence, flashing a smile that reeked of triumph. But Sonia Wallace was not defeated. Her hand slipped into her blazer pocket, retrieving her phone with deliberate ease. She tapped the screen, lifted it to her ear, and spoke in a voice so calm it cut through the cabin's tension. "Yes," she said, pausing. "We need to begin." The billionaire turned his head, a frown flickering across his face at her composure. He hadn't expected resistance, certainly not like this. He expected anger, shouting, perhaps even surrender. What he didn't expect was silence sharpened into authority. The passengers leaned in closer, curiosity sparking across the row. They didn't know who she had called. They didn't know what she intended. But they could feel it, the balance in the cabin shifting ever so slightly. The billionaire shifted uneasily, the smirk fading for the first time. And for Sonia Wallace, the seat wasn't just about comfort anymore. It was about a fight that would ripple far beyond this plane. Her voice cut through the low murmur of the cabin, steady, controlled, carrying none of the agitation the crew seemed determined to provoke. "This is Wallace," she said into the phone, the name alone heavy enough to still a few conversations nearby. "I'm on the flight. The incident has begun. Document everything." Passengers exchanged glances. A ripple of curiosity passed over the rows. This wasn't the panicked voice of someone cornered. It was the tone of a woman who had already decided how the story would end. Richard Halden shifted, his posture less certain now. He let out a small laugh, more forced than genuine, trying to cloak his unease. "What, calling customer service?" he sneered. "Go ahead, see how far that gets you." But she wasn't speaking to an airline hotline. On the other end were her attorneys and compliance officers, the same team she had assembled for the $4.8 billion partnership negotiations. They didn't just handle contracts, they handled crises. And Sonia knew that in the world she occupied, humiliation wasn't just personal, it was corporate liability. Her words were deliberate. Suspend the talks, put everything on hold until further notice. Inform the board there's been a breach, and let the regulators know we'll require an immediate review. The passengers within earshot stiffened. They understood those weren't empty instructions. This wasn't a woman making threats out of anger. This was a CEO shifting millions, no, billions of dollars with a single decision. Richard smirked, trying to reclaim dominance. "Don't bluff. Nobody stops a deal this size because of a seat." Sonia turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, her gaze cool, unwavering. "Watch me." The exchange hung in the air, and for the first time, it was Richard who looked unsettled. His bravado cracked under the weight of her composure. He glanced around, noticing the raised phones, the passengers recording his every movement, every word. What began as entitlement was fast becoming exposure. At the front of the cabin, the attendant whispered urgently to the captain, her hands moving in sharp gestures. The tension was no longer contained in row 2, it had spread like electricity through the plane. Sonia returned her focus to the call. "Yes. Immediate audit. Every compliance clause triggered, and make sure media monitoring is active. They'll want to know why this airline chose to humiliate a black CEO in first class." Gasps rolled through the cabin. A businessman 2 rows back muttered, "She's the CEO?" His tone wasn't surprise at her status. It was disbelief that someone like Richard could have dared. Richard's face flushed red, his jaw tightening. He leaned in, voice lowered to a hiss. "You think you can ruin me with a phone call?" Her reply was almost a whisper, but it carried more force than his anger. "I don't need to ruin you. You've done that yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger felt it, the shift in power. The billionaire, once certain of victory, was now shrinking under the quiet authority of the woman he had tried to erase. On the phone, Sonia's team confirmed. Understood. Actions are in motion. She ended the call, sliding the device back into her blazer with the same calm precision she had started with. For her, the moment wasn't about spectacle, it was about accountability. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't moved from her seat. And yet, in less than 5 minutes, she had transformed humiliation into a reckoning. The man beside her fidgeted, tugging at his cuffs, his earlier smugness gone. He could feel the weight of every recording device trained on him, every whisper spreading through the cabin. He had expected silence. Instead, he had ignited something much larger than himself. The attendant returned, her smile brittle, her voice trembling with the strain of authority slipping away. "Ma'am, sir, please. We need to resolve this calmly." But Sonia had already resolved it. Not with shouting, not with force, but with a phone call that carried the weight of $1 billion decision. The passengers knew it too. They leaned back, whispering not about her defiance, but about her power. A woman who had been dismissed as invisible had become undeniable in the span of minutes. And Richard Halden, who thought a seat was his by right, was beginning to realize he had just sat himself down into the collapse of his own empire. The silence that followed her call was different from the earlier hush. This time it wasn't uncertainty, it was awareness. Every person in that cabin knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The black woman who was told she didn't belong had not only claimed her seat, she had shifted the balance of power with a single phone call. Whispers rose like waves through the rows. Some passengers leaned in, eager to dissect every word they had overheard. "She said she's a CEO. She stopped $1 billion deal? My God, did you hear what she told them?" Others avoided eye contact altogether, shifting in their seats, guilt flickering in their faces for having sat quietly as the humiliation unfolded. The uneasy truth was plain. They had hesitated when they should have spoken, and now the moment had raced beyond them. Richard Halden's jaw worked furiously as he tried to summon back the dominance he had lost. He tapped his fingers sharply on the armrest, scowling at anyone who dared meet his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "She's overreacting. It's just a seat. Just a seat." The phrase carried across the cabin like an insult, as if reducing her dignity to a cushion and a row number could undo the reality of what everyone had seen. A man in business attire 3 rows back finally spoke up. "No, sir, it's not just a seat, it's respect." His words drew nods, murmurs of agreement. Some clapped softly, more a gesture of solidarity than celebration. The flight attendants looked stricken, caught between the billionaire's expectation of protection and the undeniable tide of passengers recording the confrontation on their phones. Their usual confidence had drained away, replaced with nervous half-smiles and clipped voices. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of them announced shakily over the intercom, "please remain calm. We'll be departing shortly." But the tremor in her voice betrayed the truth. Nothing about this was calm, and departure was no longer a certainty. Sonia sat motionless, her posture unbent. She didn't acknowledge the comments, didn't scan the rows for support. She didn't need to. Her power wasn't dependent on their approval. It came from something deeper, an understanding that racism thrives in silence, and that silence had just been broken. Richard tried again, leaning toward her, his tone condescending. "You people always want to make everything about race." The words sliced through the air. Gasps erupted. A woman across the aisle dropped her jaw in disbelief. Did he really just say that? Phones tilted higher. The evidence was undeniable now. Not just arrogance, not just entitlement, but racism, raw and exposed. Sonia didn't flinch. She didn't even turn her head. Her stillness said more than any rebuttal could. The billionaire had revealed himself, and no explanation would soften what had just left his lips. The murmurs sharpened into condemnation. "She paid for that seat. She has every right to be here. This is disgusting." The power dynamic had shifted. The billionaire was no longer in control of the narrative. He was on trial in the court of public opinion, and the jury was seated in rows 1 through 20. One of the attendants returned, crouching awkwardly beside Sonia. Her tone was softer now, almost pleading. "Ma'am, please, we understand. Just let us move you for today. We'll make sure you're compensated." Compensated, as if dignity could be repaid in vouchers and points, as if humiliation could be erased with a free upgrade. Sonia finally spoke, her voice quiet but cutting. "The only seat I'll be moving to is the one I chose and paid for. 2A. Applause broke out this time, firmer, louder. It wasn't unanimous, but it was strong enough to fill the cabin with affirmation. Some passengers smiled at her, others nodded in solidarity. They understood. This was no longer about a row of leather seats. This was about whether racism could still go unchecked in front of dozens of witnesses. Richard sat stiffly, color rising in his face. His entitlement had collided with resistance, and resistance had not budged. The cameras kept rolling, the whispers kept spreading, and his power shrank smaller with each second. The captain himself appeared at the front of the cabin, his expression grim. He exchanged hushed words with the attendants, his eyes flicking toward Sonia, then Richard, then the rows of watching passengers. The tension was no longer confined to a dispute. It was a crisis. And still, Sonia sat perfectly composed. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because the damage was already done. The billionaire's words were captured. The airline's hesitation was visible, and the world beyond this cabin would soon bear witness to all of it. By the time the cabin doors closed, the story had already escaped the plane. Passengers had posted their videos before the aircraft even pushed back from the gate. Clips circulated in group chats, hashtags spread like wildfire, and fragments of Richard Halden's smug dismissal were already trending on social platforms. The billionaire tried to ignore the glow of raised screens around him, but he couldn't miss the ripple effect of his own words bouncing into the digital world. The phrase, "you people," wasn't just hanging in the air anymore. It was pulsing across thousands of feeds, carried by strangers who didn't even know Sonia's name yet, but understood the insult all too well. Sonia remained composed, scrolling through her own phone briefly, forwarding the recordings from passengers directly to her legal team. She didn't need to speak again. The machinery of accountability was already in motion. At corporate headquarters, the first phone call rang through less than 20 minutes after her initial report. The compliance division had already received the instruction: suspend all ongoing negotiations. Emails stacked one after another. Urgent, crisis developing. Video of incident circulating, CEO involved. The executives in charge of the $4.8 billion partnership scrambled to understand what was happening, their carefully timed announcements suddenly unraveling in public view. For Richard, the timing couldn't have been worse. His own investment group was heavily tied into the airline deal. His presence on that very flight was meant to symbolize confidence and stability. Now, the optics were poison. Shareholders called assistance in panic. Journalists began drafting headlines: airline merger threatened by first-class confrontation. Inside the plane, he grew restless, muttering complaints about overblown reactions and social media mobs. But no one around him looked sympathetic anymore. The whispers had shifted. Where once there had been hesitation, there was now open condemnation. His privilege was cracking under the weight of witnesses who had decided not to stay silent. The attendants moved uneasily through the cabin, their earlier attempts at dismissal replaced with forced professionalism. They served drinks without meeting Sonia's gaze, knowing the cameras had caught their complicity. Even the captain's voice over the intercom sounded thinner than usual, his authority dented by the reality that the drama in row 2 was bigger than anything he could control from the cockpit. Beyond the aircraft, newsrooms began to frame the story. Commentators debated not just the arrogance of a billionaire, but the broader truth. If a black woman at the top of global business could be treated this way, what hope was there for those with less power, less visibility? And the markets noticed. Within hours, airline stocks began to wobble. Investors whispered of risk, of potential boycotts, of political pressure that could follow. Analysts who had praised the merger only days before now asked on live television, how could they allow a situation like this to happen? Didn't they realize who she was? But the most cutting observation didn't come from finance. It came from a civil rights advocate interviewed outside an airport terminal. "This isn't about who she is," the woman said. "It's about who he thought she wasn't. He didn't see a CEO. He didn't see power. He saw race, and he thought that was enough." Sonia read the statement later, nodding faintly, her expression unchanged. She had lived through that truth her entire life. This was only the latest stage where her worth had been questioned, dismissed, diminished. But this time, the consequences weren't hers to carry, they were his. Richard finally realized the gravity when his phone began to vibrate. Message after message, urgent calls from aides and board members. He ignored the first few, too proud to acknowledge his panic. But then, a single line flashed across his screen from a senior partner. "We need to talk. This is catastrophic." The smugness strained from his face. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, Richard Halden looked cornered. Passengers noticed. Someone whispered, "Now he looks nervous." Another said, "He should be." Meanwhile, Sonia's phone lit up again. A reply from her compliance team. All actions taken. Regulators informed. Media brief prepared. It was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. The viral clips, the suspended negotiations, the public outrage, together they weren't just disrupting a flight. They were threatening to collapse an empire built on arrogance and entitlement. And still, Sonia sat quietly in her rightful seat, unbothered by the turbulence now rocking the man beside her. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was enough. What had begun as an act of casual racism in a crowded cabin was now a headline shaking boardrooms across continents. The cost of his prejudice was no longer measured in discomfort or humiliation. It was being tallied in billions. And the world beyond that plane was watching, waiting to see just how far those consequences would reach. By the time the plane touched down, Sonia knew the story was already far bigger than the flight itself. Her phone pulsed with messages, journalists requesting comment, allies offering support, her board asking how she wanted to proceed. She walked calmly through the terminal, ignoring the flashes of cameras waiting near baggage claim. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was timing. She didn't rush to social media with a fiery post. She didn't give an off-the-cuff soundbite at the airport exit. Instead, she waited until she was ready. When she finally spoke, it wasn't from a place of anger, it was from clarity. In a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline, Sonia sat at the head of the table. Reporters filled every seat, cameras pointed directly at her, the air thick with anticipation. She began without preamble. "On yesterday's flight," she said evenly, "I was told I didn't belong in a seat I paid for. I was asked to move to keep the peace, and I was insulted by a man whose wealth had convinced him that dignity is negotiable." She paused, letting the words settle. The cameras zoomed closer. Reporters scribbled furiously. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened to me," she continued. "And I know I am not alone. But this time, the man who tried to erase me sat beside the very deal he thought he owned, a deal I was there to finalize, and now that deal is gone." Gasps rippled across the room. Sonia leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. "Let me be clear, I am withdrawing my company from all negotiations with the airline involved, effective immediately." The weight of her announcement struck like thunder. Journalists fired questions at once. "Are you sure? Do you understand the financial implications? Isn't this unprecedented?" She raised a hand gently, commanding silence without force. "Yes, I understand the financial implications. Yes, it is unprecedented. But what's more unprecedented is this: sitting in first class, holding a boarding pass, and still being told my presence was a problem. If a black woman who leads a multinational company can be treated this way, then what chance does a young black traveler have when no one is watching?" Her words resonated far beyond the room. Clips spread across news channels, replayed endlessly on television, dissected in think pieces online. She hadn't just withdrawn from a deal. She had reframed the entire incident into a conversation about systemic racism in air travel. Richard Halden, once untouchable, was now the face of that racism. Every network replayed his sneer, his slur, his casual entitlement. His defenders were few, his critics growing by the hour. Business reporters speculated openly about how much his arrogance had cost not only him, but the airline and its shareholders. Sonia's calm authority stood in stark contrast. She didn't need outrage to be heard. Her restraint was more powerful than any shouting match could have been. Civil rights groups praised her decision, calling it a masterclass in turning humiliation into accountability. Former airline employees came forward with their own stories, many echoing the same theme: that certain passengers were always treated with preference, and others always treated with suspicion. Within days, Sonia was invited onto primetime interviews. She didn't tell her story with bitterness. She told it with precision, laying bare the facts, then asking the questions others were too afraid to voice. "How many times has this happened to people who don't have my platform?" she asked. "How many have been humiliated, silenced, or forced to leave their seat because someone decided their presence was inconvenient? What message are we sending when wealth excuses racism and dignity is treated as disposable?" Audiences listened. Viewers at home, many of whom had lived through quieter but equally cutting moments of discrimination, saw themselves in her composure. They saw their own humiliations in her story, and for once, they saw someone who refused to let it be swept away. The airline released a statement calling it a regrettable misunderstanding. But the public wasn't buying it. The videos were too clear. The witnesses were too many. The man at the center was too recognizable. Sonia didn't respond directly to their half-apology. She didn't need to. Her stance was already etched into history. She had walked away, and with her went billions. And yet, it wasn't the loss of money that defined the moment. It was the gain of visibility. For once, racism wasn't being debated in hushed tones. It was being broadcast from trading floors to living rooms, exposed by a woman who had refused to be moved. Sonia Wallace hadn't sought the spotlight. But now that it had found her, she made sure it illuminated the truth. That power without justice is worthless, and silence in the face of racism is no longer an option. Richard Halden had built his empire on perception. To investors, he was a visionary. To politicians, a reliable donor. To society pages, the picture of influence. But perception is fragile, and in less than a week, the image he'd curated for decades was in ruins. The first cracks appeared on the trading floor. His investment firm's stock, once considered bulletproof, slipped 5% in a single day. Commentators attributed the dip to investor unease, but insiders knew the truth. Confidence in Halden was evaporating. His name, once a strength, had become a liability. Clients began withdrawing funds quietly at first, then in waves. Pension boards and university endowments issued terse statements. "We are reassessing our relationship with Halden Capital in light of recent events." The words were sterile, but the meaning was clear. He was toxic. Richard watched the numbers fall from his Manhattan office, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles blanched. He barked at aides, slammed doors, demanded new press strategies. But no press release could erase the video clips replaying endlessly across every screen. His sneer, his slur, his arrogant claim to a seat that wasn't his. His phone buzzed constantly, but the voices on the other end were no longer allies. Partners he'd known for decades distanced themselves. "Richard, this is bad optics." One told him bluntly, "Our board can't justify standing by you." Another was sharper. "You've cost us billions. Don't call again." Even the airline, once eager to showcase his involvement, issued a statement severing all ties. They called him a non-essential participant in negotiations. Behind the corporate language was an unmistakable truth. He was now a burden they could not afford. In the halls of his firm, whispers followed him. Employees avoided eye contact, conversations cut off when he walked past. Younger associates, once eager to curry favor, now traded memes mocking his downfall. To them, he wasn't a titan anymore. He was a cautionary tale. The final blow came during a hastily convened board meeting. Richard entered expecting a fight, prepared to strong-arm his way back into control. Instead, he was met with cold faces and clipped tones. "Your behavior," one director said, "has jeopardized every major partnership we have. We cannot protect you from this." He protested, voice booming across the room. "It was one incident. She's exaggerating." But the words only confirmed what they already knew. His arrogance hadn't diminished. It had grown louder, more desperate. The directors exchanged glances, then delivered the verdict. Effective immediately, Richard Halden was removed as chairman of Halden Capital. The headlines were merciless. Billionaire toppled by first-class racism. From power seat to empty seat, Halden ousted. Late-night hosts mocked him in monologues. Sketch comedians reenacted his sneer. He wasn't feared anymore. He was ridiculed. For Richard, the humiliation cut deeper than the financial loss. His identity had always been bound to dominance, to the assumption that money bought silence, obedience, forgiveness. Now money couldn't buy back what he had lost, credibility. And as his empire crumbled, Sonia's stature only grew. Every panel, every interview framed the contrasts starkly. The billionaire who tried to erase a black woman, and the black woman whose dignity dismantled his power. In private, Richard seethed. He called the incident a witch hunt, a smear campaign, but no one cared what he called it anymore. The world had seen him clearly, and once seen, he could not be unseen. The collapse wasn't a single event. It was a series of doors closing, clients walking away, investors pulling back, friends vanishing from his contact list. The man who once believed the world bent to his will was learning, in the most public way possible, that arrogance has a cost, and the bill was coming due. The collapse of Richard Halden was dramatic, but the deeper question lingered. Why had this incident happened at all? Why, in a world where titles and money are supposed to command respect, was a black woman still treated as though she didn't belong in the very seat she had purchased? The truth was sobering. Sonia's story wasn't unique. It was only visible because she had the resources and resolve to make sure it couldn't be buried. For every viral video of discrimination at 30,000 feet, there were countless others that went unrecorded, unheard, dismissed as misunderstandings. Studies had shown the pattern for years. Black travelers were more likely to be asked to prove their tickets, more likely to be told to move seats, more likely to be removed from flights under the excuse of non-compliance. What happened to Sonia wasn't an accident. It was part of a system where dignity was conditional, often stripped away the moment someone decided a black passenger was out of place. The irony was sharp. Sonia Wallace had been on that flight not as a leisure traveler, but as the very business partner who could have elevated the airline into new markets. And still, her accomplishments, her influence, her wealth, none of it shielded her from being reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin. The footage of Richard sneering, the words, "you people," spilling from his mouth, became a symbol, not just of one man's arrogance, but of the ugly truth that bias didn't stop at the boardroom door or the cabin curtain. Commentators asked the question Sonia herself had posed. If this can happen to her, what happens to those without her power? The answer was already clear in the stories that began to pour out in the days following her stand. A young law student tweeted that she had been escorted off a flight after questioning why her seat assignment had been changed at the gate. A black mother described being asked to prove her child was hers before boarding, despite holding both tickets in her hand. A professor shared that he had been called aggressive for requesting the same assistance given freely to white passengers. Sonia's story had cracked open a conversation too long ignored. It wasn't just about first class. It wasn't just about Richard Halden. It was about the quiet indignities repeated daily in airports and airplanes around the world. Indignities that rarely made headlines but always left scars. Civil rights groups seized the moment, pushing for hearings, demanding accountability. Lawmakers who had once overlooked travel discrimination suddenly found themselves answering questions from angry constituents. Regulators asked airlines to produce diversity reports on their staff and training. The ripple Sonia began in row 2 was swelling into a tide. And still, beneath the statistics and policies, the human truth remained. Sonia had faced what so many had endured, being told that success, money, education, none of it mattered in the face of racism. That even when you are the deal maker, you can still be treated as disposable. Her quiet resistance, her decision not to move, was more than personal defiance. It was a reminder to every black traveler who had been humiliated, to every professional who had been overlooked, to every child who had seen their parents insulted, that their dignity was not optional. For Sonia, the ordeal was never just about one seat. It was about exposing the lie that progress alone erases prejudice. It was about showing that racism, even when dressed in suits and airline uniforms, remained alive in the everyday. And because she refused to be silent, the world was finally forced to see it. The press conferences faded, the headlines shifted, but the impact of Sonia Wallace's stand didn't disappear. What began as humiliation in a first-class cabin had become the seed of something far larger. A movement rooted not in anger alone, but in resolve. Sonia refused to let the story close on her alone. She established the Equal Skies Initiative, a program designed to track, report, and combat racial bias in air travel. Within weeks, her organization launched a hotline where travelers could submit incidents of discrimination. The calls poured in faster than even she had expected. One man described being denied boarding because an attendant didn't like his tone. A nurse reported being ignored for medical assistance during an emergency until a white passenger repeated her words. Parents recounted their children being questioned about their legitimacy on international flights. The stories were endless, each one echoing the same truth Sonia had faced, that racism in the skies was not rare. It was routine. She didn't stop with documentation. Her initiative began training programs for airline staff, creating partnerships with advocacy groups, and pushing regulators for stronger penalties when bias was proven. She met with lawmakers, testified before committees, and spoke plainly. If airlines want our business, they must also respect our dignity. Her words resonated not only with policymakers, but with everyday people. Letters arrived at her office from across the country. Some were handwritten on lined paper, others typed and neatly folded. A teenager wrote, "I've never flown before, but watching you gave me courage. One day I'll take my first flight, and I won't be scared of being treated like I don't belong." A retired teacher said, "Thank you for showing that silence isn't the only option. I wish I had your strength when it happened me years ago." Even a few flight attendants, anonymously, admitted relief that someone had finally said aloud what they had witnessed for years. The ripple reached beyond the airline industry. Corporate leaders began re-examining their own boards and practices, asking whether diversity in leadership was symbolic or substantive. Universities held discussions about Sonia's decision to sacrifice billions for dignity, teaching it not just as a business move, but as a moral stand. Through it all, Sonia remained steady. She didn't allow herself to be framed as a martyr or a savior. She reminded anyone who asked that she had simply acted in the moment, refusing to give up her seat, her space, her worth. The power, she said, was never in the phone call. It was in not moving when I was told to. For those who had been humiliated quietly on flights and buses and trains, that sentence became a mantra. Not moving, not yielding, not letting racism dictate their worth. In town halls, community gatherings, and social media threads, people repeated her story, sometimes changing the details but always keeping the essence. A black woman told she didn't belong, refusing to move, and changing everything because of it. Richard Halden's empire had collapsed, but Sonia's influence was only expanding. She had turned an attempted erasure into a platform for visibility. Where once her name was confined to boardrooms and financial pages, now it carried across living rooms, classrooms, and communities. Her stand had become more than her own. It had become a mirror, forcing the world to confront how many others had been dismissed, ignored, erased. And in that mirror, people found courage. The seat in row 2 was more than leather and metal. It was a stage where arrogance tried to erase dignity, where silence threatened to swallow truth, where racism dared to show itself in plain daylight. But Sonia Wallace refused to move. And in refusing, she reshaped not only her own moment, but the fate of those who watched, and the empire of the man who thought wealth made him untouchable. The billionaire lost more than money. He lost the illusion that his privilege could protect him forever. His name was stripped from the boards he once chaired, his deals crumbled, and his reputation became a warning etched into headlines. But Sonia gained something that couldn't be measured in profit or stock value. She gained the knowledge that her defiance had given voice to thousands who had been silenced. Her refusal had told the world, we belong everywhere, our tickets, our labor, our worth, take us. Her stand wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was steady, calm, undeniable. And that steadiness reverberated far beyond the cabin. So the question now falls to you. If you had been sitting in that plane, watching a black woman told to leave her seat, would you have spoken up? Would you have recorded the truth, challenged the bias, or stayed silent like so many do? If you believe no one should be humiliated because of their race, then let this story stay with you, not as entertainment, but as responsibility. Because racism doesn't always show itself in boardrooms or on viral clips. It shows up in the quiet places too, in classrooms, in stores, in waiting rooms, in the thousands small humiliations people carry every day. And when it does, silence only protects the one doing the harm. Here at Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, we tell stories not to sensationalize, but to remind you, injustice thrives in the dark, but it falters when witnessed. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and join a community that refuses to stay quiet. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Your voice, your presence, matters more than you know. Because every story we share is more than a video. It's a call for dignity, a reminder that silence can be broken, that hope echoes louder than hate. Sonia Wallace's journey shows us that one act of defiance, refusing to move from a seat that was hers, can ripple into billions of dollars lost for those who profit off injustice, and billions of moments gained for those who finally feel seen. It leaves us with a truth that cannot be erased. Racism can strip away comfort, but it cannot strip away worth, not unless we allow it. And so the story ends where it began, in row 2. Beside a man who thought power was his birthright, he rose believing he could take what wasn't his, and in the end, he lost everything. She stayed seated, and in doing so, reminded the world of something too often forgotten. Dignity is not negotiable.